The white rose was still in my hand, cool petals going soft at the edges, a single brown bruise forming along one petal where my fingers had gripped too tightly. When Ashley leaned close and said, in a voice more suited to a business call than a graveside, that I needed to compose myself. My husband of 38 years was being lowered into the ground 6 feet in front of me, and my daughter-in-law was monitoring my emotional propriety. I turned to look at her. Her eyes were dry. They had been dry all morning through the service, through the eulogies, through the moment when the pastor read the psalm Harold had chosen for himself years earlier, and Daniel had broken down beside me and gripped my hand hard enough to bruise. Ashley had stood through all of it with the particular stillness of someone who is performing grief rather than feeling it. Shoulders back, expression arranged into something tasteful and solemn, her gloved hands folded at her waist like she was waiting for a meeting to begin. Then she leaned close and told me very quietly that I was embarrassing myself. I did not answer her. I could not speak. The cold of that November morning had settled into my coat, into my shoulders, into the space behind my sternum where everything hurt. The ground under my heels was soft from 2 days of rain, and the silver-gray sky pressed down flat and low over the cemetery, and there were perhaps 40 people standing in that circle of grief around Harold's grave, and not one of them, not the colleagues, not the neighbors, not the old friends who had driven from 2 counties away, was dry-eyed. Only Ashley. And something shifted in my chest in that moment, a small, precise click of recognition, like a tumbler falling in a lock. I did not know what it meant yet, not fully. I would understand it completely 6 days later, when a lawyer named Robert Haynes opened a leather folder in his downtown office and began reading aloud a document that Ashley had been assembling, quietly and systematically, for the better part of 2 years. She had not been crying at the funeral because she had not been grieving. She had been waiting. Harold James Caldwell and I married in June of 1985 in the small white-painted church on the edge of our hometown where my mother and her mother before her had married. It was a hot Ohio summer, and the flowers had wilted by ceremony time, and the ceiling fan moved warm air without cooling anything, and none of that mattered because Harold was at the altar in his father's suit, looking at me with those quiet, dark eyes that softened in a way I had never seen them soften for anyone else. We were steady people who built a steady life. Harold worked 35 years as a civil engineer for the county. I was a registered nurse for 26 years before my knees required a move to administrative work. We raised Daniel in a Victorian house on Elm Creek Road with a wraparound porch and a deep garden where Harold grew roses and tomatoes and the occasional overambitious pumpkin every summer, methodical and patient, moving through the beds in the late afternoon light, while I watched from the kitchen window and thought that this was what real happiness looked like. Not dramatic, not loud, just a man in a garden he had made with his own hands, in a life that was entirely, unspectacularly his. The house itself was built in 1908, with high ceilings and drafty windows and a staircase that creaked on the 3rd and 7th steps. Sounds so familiar, they had become a kind of music to me over 3 decades. Harold had refinished the hardwood floors himself one long autumn, moving furniture room to room and working by lamplight in the evenings until it was done. We had repainted the exterior twice, replaced the boiler once, buried 2 cats under the rose bushes in the back garden. That house was not just an address. It was the physical record of everything we had lived together, and Harold had been meticulous about ensuring it would be protected when he was gone. By the time he retired at 62, it was fully paid off. His investment portfolio was solid and diversified. His pension was decent. He had a life insurance policy and savings bonds that had matured quietly over the decades, and he had spent a careful afternoon with our attorney 4 years before his death, setting up a trust that reflected exactly what he wanted for all of it. Daniel was 35 when he brought Ashley Marlowe home for the first time, on a cool Sunday in March. She was 31, recently relocated for a position with a regional real estate firm, and she was, by any objective standard, impressive. Slender, composed, effortlessly fluent in social situations, the kind of woman who assesses a room the moment she enters it and makes everyone in it feel they have passed some unspoken evaluation. She had a quick mind and a way of listening that made you feel your words were being genuinely weighed. Daniel had fallen hard and fast, completely and without reservation, the way he had always done with things he wanted. I liked her in the beginning. I want to be clear about that even now. Harold was quieter. He had always read people quickly and said little about what he found, but his silences had textures, and the silence he kept around Ashley was measured and watchful in a way I recognized without pressing. They married 14 months after meeting. The wedding was beautifully and precisely organized, every detail attended to with a thoroughness that, in retrospect, I should have recognized as deeply characteristic. Daniel looked happy in the slightly dazed way of a man who has stepped into a current stronger than expected and decided to stop fighting it. I thought it was love. I still think it was, on his side, at least in the beginning. The first real alarm came 4 months after the wedding, on a gray Thursday evening when I drove over unannounced with a casserole, because Harold had been nauseated all week from his new medication and I had made far too much food. I still had my key from the years Daniel lived there alone. I came in through the back the way I always had, 2 steps up from the garden, the door that always swelled slightly in damp weather. And Ashley was in the kitchen with her back to me, phone pressed to her ear, posture upright and focused in the particular way she carried herself on business calls. The kitchen light was on, that warm amber yellow Harold and I had always meant to replace with something brighter and somehow never had. "The portfolio isn't publicly listed," she was saying, "but I've seen the statements. We're looking at somewhere between $400,000 and $450,000, not counting the house. The property would list at $320 minimum in this market, probably $350 with some cosmetic work before listing. The question is really timeline." A pause while she listened. Right. Which is exactly why patience is the strategy here. The old man's health is trending the way it's trending. It won't be long. We just need the documentation in order before anything needs to move. I stood in the hallway for a very long time. The linoleum was cold through my shoes. The casserole dish was burning hot in my hands. I had forgotten I was holding it. And I remember that contrast with strange clarity. Warm hands, cold floor, while the rest of me existed in a kind of suspended stillness I had never felt before. Ashley shifted slightly as she spoke, and I could see the clean line of her profile, her composed expression, the small, precise gestures she made with her free hand. She was beautiful. She sounded like someone closing a property deal. "The old man," she had said. "His health is trending." I backed out the way I had come and sat in my car at the end of the driveway for a long time, watching the lit windows of the kitchen. Then I drove home and told myself I had misheard, or misunderstood, or projected meaning onto a fragment of conversation that belonged to an entirely different context. I was thorough and convincing and completely wrong. I did not tell Harold. That was my first mistake, and I have carried it every day since. Over the following year, Ashley wove herself into Harold's daily life with the patience of someone following a careful plan. She drove him to cardiology appointments when Daniel was at work, and Harold appreciated it. She brought groceries on Tuesdays. She suggested, 8 months after the wedding, that Harold's filing system had become unwieldy. Wouldn't it be easier, she said, with a proper organizational structure? Harold, who found administrative tasks tedious, agreed. She spent an afternoon in his study with folders and labels in her neat handwriting, and afterward, Harold sometimes had to look twice to find documents he had always known exactly where to find. There were questions over dinner, casual and curious, whether Harold had considered putting the house in Daniel's name for tax purposes, whether he was satisfied with his financial advisor, what he envisioned for the future of things. His own phrase, which she adopted and reflected back at him with what I now recognize as surgical precision. Harold answered honestly, because honesty was his nature and suspicion was not. I watched from across the table and felt something slow and cold moving through me that I was not yet willing to name. 6 weeks before Harold died, on a Tuesday evening in early October when the maples outside were turning orange and gold, he called me into the study and closed the door. The room smelled of old paper and the warm glow of the desk lamp, and Harold looked tired in a way different from his usual illness. Tiredness. Something interior, something that had been quietly removed from him. He had a folder on the desk. He pushed it toward me without speaking first, and I opened it with hands steadier than they felt. Inside were photocopies of Harold's will and the investment account statements. Beneath those were 2 documents I did not immediately recognize. The first was a durable power of attorney, naming Ashley Renee Caldwell as Harold's legal representative in all financial matters, effective immediately. The second was titled First Amendment to Last Will and Testament of Harold James Caldwell, and its meaning, once I followed the dense legal language to its core, was very clear. The entirety of the estate, the house, the investments, the pension survivor benefits, the savings bonds, everything would pass directly to Daniel and Ashley as joint tenants with right of survivorship, bypassing entirely the trust structure and the specific bequests Harold had arranged 4 years ago. Both documents were dated the previous July. Both bore a signature that looked, at first glance, like Harold's. Harold watched me read. When I looked up, his face was the face of a man who is very angry and very controlled about it. Hands flat on the desk, jaw set, eyes steady and dark. "I did not sign those," he said. "I have not met with any attorney in the past 2 years other than Robert Haynes, and Robert will confirm that these did not come through his office. I found them when I went looking for my insurance folder last week. They were filed in a section labeled Estate Planning, Updated, in Ashley's handwriting." He paused, and the room was very quiet. "Take those copies home. Lock them somewhere she cannot access. I am going to call Robert in the morning." I asked whether he wanted to go to the police immediately. He said he wanted to confirm through proper channels first before saying anything to Daniel. He looked at me with those steady dark eyes and said very quietly that he was sorry. I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. I took the folder home and locked it in my bedroom filing cabinet behind a box of Christmas ornaments that had not been moved in 3 years. Harold died 11 days later. Wednesday morning, early hours, a massive cardiac event his cardiologist had been warning us was possible for the past 18 months. He died in our bedroom, with me beside him before the ambulance arrived. He died before he could speak to Robert Haynes, before he could say a single word to Daniel, before any of what he had discovered could move through any proper channel at all. 6 days after that, I sat down in Robert Haynes's office with Daniel on my left and Ashley on my right, and the room was warm and smelled of old carpet and coffee. And Robert opened his folder, and I watched Ashley's hands resting perfectly still in her lap, and I thought about the white rose I had dropped at the graveside because my fingers had gone numb with cold, and I waited. Robert Haynes was a careful man. He had been Harold's attorney for 22 years, and he had the manner of someone who had spent 2 decades delivering news. Good news, bad news, news that rearranged the furniture of people's lives entirely, and had learned that the most useful thing he could offer in those moments was stillness. He opened the folder slowly. He set his reading glasses on the bridge of his nose. He looked at each of us once before he began. His gaze rested on Ashley for just a fraction of a second longer than it rested on Daniel or me, and something in the quality of that look made my hands tighten in my lap. He began with the existing will, the one Harold had drawn up in this very office 4 years ago, the one I knew by heart because Harold had walked me through it afterward at our kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold between us. The house would pass to me as surviving spouse, held in trust. The investment portfolio would be divided, the majority to me for living expenses and security, a specified portion to Daniel. There were smaller bequests to Harold's brother in Cincinnati, to our church's building fund, to a scholarship at the engineering school where Harold had studied. It was modest, considered, exactly Harold. Then Robert paused. He set down the first document and picked up the second. "I am required to note," he said in a voice that was very quiet and very precise, "that I received a communication 3 weeks ago from a second attorney, a Mr. Gerald Foss, whose office is located in Millhaven, submitting what was presented to me as a duly executed First Amendment to this testament, signed and witnessed on the 15th of July of last year." He looked up over his glasses. "Under standard practice, I am obligated to present this amendment alongside the original document. However, I also need to state for the record that I did not prepare this amendment, that I have no record of any instruction from Harold Caldwell to alter his estate plan in any way during the period in question, and that I have already retained a forensic documents consultant to examine the signatures on both instruments." The room went very quiet. I could hear the hum of the building's ventilation system. I could feel Ashley, slightly to my right, go absolutely still in a way that was different from her usual composure. Tighter, coiled, the stillness of something that has been startled and is deciding how to respond. Daniel shifted in his chair. I did not look at either of them. I was watching Robert. "If you would permit me," I said, and I opened my handbag and set the folder on the table. "Harold gave me these copies 6 weeks before he died. He told me he had not signed the amendment or the power of attorney. He told me to keep them locked away until he had spoken with you." I slid the folder across to Robert. "He died before that conversation could happen." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Robert opened the folder, and I watched him examine the photocopies beside the originals in his own file, and I watched his expression do nothing at all, which was, from Robert Haynes, extremely eloquent. Then I made myself look at Ashley. She had turned to face me. Her expression was still composed, but something had shifted beneath the surface of it. Something had moved behind her eyes, cold and fast, like a shadow moving under ice. She smiled at me. It was the most frightening smile I had ever seen on a human face. "Margaret," she said, and her voice was warm and slightly sad, exactly as if I were a confused elderly woman who had wandered somewhere she didn't belong. I understand that grief can make people misinterpret things. Harold was unwell for a long time. Sometimes people imagine... Ashley. My voice came out very calm. I had not planned it to sound that way. It simply did. Robert has a forensic examiner. Gerald Foss's records will show when those documents were commissioned and who commissioned them. Your signature is on the witnessing line of the power of attorney. Would you like to continue? The smile remained for exactly 2 more seconds. Then it dissolved, and what replaced it was something I had not seen from Ashley before. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of recalibration, a rapid internal adjustment, the expression of someone switching strategies in real time. She turned to Daniel. "Daniel," she said, and her voice changed entirely, went soft and slightly trembling. "You know why I did this. You know what I was trying to protect. Tell them." I turned to my son. Daniel was staring at the table. His hands were flat on his thighs. His jaw was working. He looked, at that moment, very young in the worst possible way. Not youthful, but unfinished, like a man who had been handed a choice he had been avoiding for 2 years and had run out of room to keep walking away from it. "Daniel," I said. And I said nothing else, because there was nothing else needed. He looked up at me. His eyes were red. "She told me she was updating the estate planning," he said. "She said it was just a formality, making sure things were structured properly. She said Dad would appreciate it." He stopped. He swallowed. I told myself I didn't need to know the details, that she knew what she was doing, that it was fine. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he looked back down at the table. And I understood then, fully and without any remaining doubt, that my son had not been innocent. He had been convenient. He had chosen not to ask questions because the answers would have required him to act, and action had always been the thing Daniel found hardest when it came to Ashley. That was the second blow. Harold's death had been the first. This was quieter and smaller, and in some ways it hurt more, because Daniel was my son, and I had known him since before he had a name, and I had believed, without ever really examining the belief, that he was fundamentally a good person. I still believe that in the complicated way you believe things about people you love, but good people make terrible choices, and sometimes they make them for years in small daily increments, and each individual choice is so minor that it never quite rises to the level of a thing you have to call by its real name. Robert excused himself quietly and stepped out of the room. The 3 of us sat there. The ventilation hummed. Ashley was looking at me with an expression I had no name for. Not remorse, certainly, but something calculating, something that was still trying to find a way through. "We could handle this privately," she said. Her voice was back to its professional register. "There's no reason to involve—" "The police are already aware," I said. She blinked. Just once. "What?" "I called Detective Karen Shea at the County Fraud Unit 9 days ago. I gave her the copies Harold left me and a statement about what he told me before he died. She has been in contact with Gerald Foss's office. She is waiting for the results of Robert's forensic examination, which she expects by the end of this week." I paused. I was not going to wait until this meeting to act. Harold did not raise me to wait. Ashley stood up. For the first time since I had known her, she looked unsteady. Not physically, but in some deeper way, as if the floor of her carefully constructed world had given slightly under her feet. "You have no idea. she said, and her voice was low and tight and entirely stripped of its usual polish. "How much I have invested in this family." "I know exactly how much you invested," I said. $450,000 plus the house. That was your number." She left the room. The door closed behind her with a soft, controlled click that was somehow worse than a slam. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple, and I want to be honest about that. Nothing that comes after a betrayal is clean. Daniel moved out of the house he shared with Ashley the same evening and came to stay in his old bedroom at my house on Elm Creek Road, and we sat at the kitchen table for a very long time on the first night with tea going cold between us, the way tea always had in that house. And we talked for hours in the careful, circling way of people who have things to say that they are not yet sure how to say. He told me everything, or rather, the version of everything he had access to, which was incomplete, because Ashley had been systematically keeping him informed of only what she wanted him to know. He had known she was restructuring Harold's estate documents. He had not known the documents were forged. He had not known she had engaged Gerald Foss independently in a town 40 minutes away, using a notarized copy of Harold's signature obtained, as the investigators would later confirm, from a document Harold had signed in Ashley's presence during one of the Tuesday grocery visits. The forensic examiner's report came back 10 days after the meeting in Robert's office. The signatures on the amendment and the power of attorney were confirmed forgeries. High quality, clearly produced from a genuine signature template, but not Harold's hand. Gerald Foss, when interviewed by Detective Shea, was cooperative in a way that suggested he had had reservations about his client from the beginning. He had documented everything. His documentation, as it turned out, was the thing that sealed the case. There was one more thing, which came out during the investigation and which I find hardest to absorb even now. Ashley had opened a joint account with Daniel 18 months into their marriage, positioned as a household management account, and had been making regular transfers from it into a separate account in her name alone. Small enough, individually, that Daniel had not noticed the pattern. Over 18 months, the transfers totaled just over $42,000. Daniel cooperated fully with the investigation. He filed for divorce 3 weeks after Ashley was charged. The proceedings were uncomplicated in the end because she had been thorough in ways that made the financial record very clear. Ashley was charged with document forgery, attempted fraud, and obtaining financial instruments by deception. She accepted a plea agreement that included full restitution, 3 years of probation, and a permanent fraud conviction on her record. She did not go to prison. I will not pretend I was not angry about that, because I was for a while. I sat with the anger in Harold's study in the evenings, at his desk with the lamp on, and I let myself feel it fully, which I think he would have wanted rather than setting it aside too quickly. Then, gradually, I let it go. Not because she deserved forgiveness, but because carrying it was a weight I did not want to carry for the rest of my life, and I had always been a practical woman. Daniel is different now, quieter, more deliberate, more careful about the places he puts his trust. He comes to dinner on Sundays. He works in the garden sometimes on weekend mornings, moving through the rose beds with the focused stillness Harold used to bring to the same task, early before the heat arrives. While I watch from the kitchen window with my coffee warming my hands, he is not Harold. He will never be Harold. But he is my son, and he is trying, and that is enough. I am still in the house on Elm Creek Road. The staircase still creaks on the 3rd and 7th steps. The kitchen light is still that amber yellow I always meant to replace, and now I find I do not want to. The roses came back this summer, all of them, even the old climbing one along the back fence that I had thought might not survive the winter. Harold had planted it the year Daniel started high school, and it bloomed in June the way it always had. Deep red, extravagant, faintly fragrant in the evenings when the heat of the day had passed and the garden went quiet. I sat on the back porch on one of those evenings in late June and drank my tea and watched the light change over the garden, and I thought about Harold's hands flat on the desk as he pushed that folder toward me, steady and deliberate even then. He had known, in the particular quiet way Harold always knew things, that I would not look away, that I would not tell myself comfortable stories, that when the time came, I would be the one to act. He had known me for 38 years. He was right. I set down my cup. The climbing rose moved slightly along the fence in the evening air, and the garden smelled of warm earth and those red blooms, and the light was going gold and long across the lawn, and I thought, I am still here. I am still in this house. Everything he built is still here. She did not get it. She did not get any of it. Some things, when you fight for them hard enough, you get to keep.